Welcome, everybody, to episode 5 of Man We Need to Talk, the podcast that focuses on male mental health and the stigmas that are still attached to it in today's modern society. Today, I'm joined by Darren Butler. Darren is self-employed, and he's come today to speak to us about his challenges with his own personal mental health and how he's overcome them. Thanks ever so much, Darren, for joining us on the show today. How have you been on this crazy year so far, would you say?
Yeah, it has. It's been certainly been a memorable one for all the wrong reasons, I would say, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I've dealt with it as best I can. My business that I had before lockdown back in March was doing okay. It was growing, and then lockdown happened. I kind of went from doing okay to basically having next to nothing overnight, which was a bit, jarring mentally. But out of it has come a completely brand new business. So I started basically making cheesecakes just to kind of bring some income in, something that I was quite skilled at and did for friends and family already. And yeah, that's just kind of taken on a whole new life on its own. So it's been a bit of a wild ride.
Yeah, and the cheesecakes look awesome, by the way. I definitely have to get one ordered for sure. They look really, really nice. So just before we sort of delve more into sort of, what you've been doing in terms of what's been happening this year, could you just give listeners a bit more information about you, where you're from, your age, your family situation?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm 33 years of age, from the south of England. Family situation is myself, my fiance, my 2-year-old daughter, and then we've got 4 stepkids from my fiance's previous relationships. They're all like different ages, and they're all going through different things at the same time as well, which has its challenges. So the oldest is 17, and then we've got 15, 13, 10, and yeah, as I say, my youngest is 2 years old. So it's a madhouse at the best of times.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it would be challenging because, like you say, if you've got kids of different ages, obviously at different ages, they do have different issues and stuff, don't they? So I can only imagine that the combination and the dynamics must be quite challenging at times. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, definitely. I think the oldest being in college and having like a quite an active social life and having a job and everything else like that, like we hardly see her. Like she's in and out and does like has her own life really. And then the complete opposite to that, we've got a 15-year-old boy who's doing his GCSEs at the moment, has absolutely no idea what college he wants to go to or what he wants to do, next academic year. Far more interested in just sitting down and playing Fortnite with his mates and everything else like that. And then to flip it on its head again, we've got his sister who's 2 years younger than he is, head screwed on, knows exactly what she wants to do. She's going to be like go catering college and everything else like that. Like she's already got it worked out, and she's still got another 3-4 years of school left to do yet. So yeah, and then the 10-year-old is just ditzy as anything. Like she'll forget her own name if you didn't remind her 5 times a day.
How would you say that, when lockdown happened, how would you say that the impact of lockdown, how did that change the dynamics in terms of your own mental health and the general situation in the family home?
Yeah, massively, because we went from just being like the parent and doing the things that normal parents do, teaching right from wrongs, doing like the dinners and after school clubs and doing all that, to then actually having to throw in that 6 hours of homeschooling and teaching as well. And again, where they're all different ages, they're at different levels in the curriculum. So we've got primary school, senior school, got one preparing to go to college and do his GCSEs, and one is just about finding her way through senior school. It was a bit crazy just trying to get that organization together, like helping a 9, 10-year-old with English and spellings, all the way through to, sitting down with your 12, 13-year-old and talking about complicated like algebra calculations. And it's stuff that I myself have not done really since I left school myself. So it's a good 15, almost 20 years since I've even really had to use any of that kind of stuff anyway. And that kind of brought up a bit of a conversation as well. It was just kind of like, because the frustration of it was like, from my side was, you're never going to use it. Because I've never used it, I projected onto them, you're never going to use it. It's pointless. Why are you even learning this? Because I couldn't do it, that frustration like came out, and I think actually that's where Jessica is kind of made that decision that, like, she's got her head screwed on, she knows what she wants to do, and she's structured her learning like around that. So going into catering and hospitality and stuff like that is, I've seen it come through in the work that she's done at school since. Like, she's far more concerned with like creativity and helping me out with like the cakes, and she's got so much more interest when it comes to baking and things like that than she has English, maths and science.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely good that, she wants to get involved. Just touching on something you said there about algebra and stuff like that. I'm not sure I was very good at that in the first place. So and when my boys come to an age where they're going to be asking me questions about that, I'm probably going to be a bit like, well, don't really know, sorry.
Yeah.
But also something else you mentioned about how we can project our own sort of insecurities onto our children. You can do, can't you? Because if sometimes you don't know something, it's almost like an inner frustration from the inner child, isn't it? Just when you don't know something, you almost get mad at them because it's like, well, you shouldn't question my knowledge or something like that. Because you feel like as a parent that you should just know everything, don't you?
Well, that's the kind of stance that I took, was that, I'm the adult, I know what I'm talking about, I know the answers. And then when it became quite clear that I didn't, they kind of then got the feeling that I didn't know what I was talking about, I wasn't qualified, etc., etc. And that was absolutely true. I'm not a teacher. I don't know complicated, algebra, and there's even just stuff about like basic English that I've learnt it, I use it every single day, but I don't think about things like prepositions and nouns and pronouns and things like that. I couldn't really accurately explain what they are and where they're placed, even though I copyright for a living, or did for my business, and largely I enjoy writing articles and stories and things like that. So my grammar and my spelling and all that, and the way I structure stuff is always really, really well written. But come to me and ask me, what's a pronoun, what's a preposition, where does this belong, it just all goes out the window.
Yeah, no, definitely. I can really relate to that. So I'm just interested, you mentioned there about, you've been self-employed. I'm also self-employed, so I understand the pressures of, the uncertainty and things like that. When lockdown happened, how did those pressures affect you, would you say?
So in the first kind of few weeks when we were leading up to it, and it was becoming more and more obvious that the lockdown was going to happen, I was actually preparing for my business to kind of explode and be one of the busiest periods, and it was going to grow. It's going to be fantastic, because in my head, the idea that everyone was going to be locked at home, on their phones, on social media, like, for me, that would have been the perfect time for brands to execute like great marketing, great advertising, and make use of the situation, or make use of the fact that more and more people are going to be on their phones, on social media, because they've got all this spare time. What I didn't factor in was, obviously, those businesses that I was working with had to close or put staff on furlough, or even kind of, or even close down altogether. And so my income went from being a fairly reasonable one to literally zero overnight. And the pressure of that was incredible, because we've all got bills to pay. We've got rent to pay, and I've got debts that I'm managing, and things like that. So yeah, it was a very stressful few weeks, which is where like the cheesecake thing came from. It was like, well, what can I do to make money? And it was just, yeah, it organically just kind of happened that friends and family were prepared to pay me to make the cakes, rather than just accept them as gifts for free. Word of mouth got round, and we sat here kind of 9 months down the road. I've made over 250 cakes, and I'm charging anywhere between sort of 13 and 17 pounds for them per cake now. So it's almost become more successful than my previous business.
Wow, that's great. And hats off to you as well. Because often when there's a failure, a lot of people, how they'll react is they'll just slip into victim mode and then they won't try again. So it's really admirable that you pick yourself up and you're now doing something positive and you've got something else going on. So well done, mate.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I know we touched on about your mental health issues in terms of the lockdown and stuff. So if we could just get a bit more of a background in terms of over time in your life what sort of mental health issues that you've had and how they've manifested to start with, if you don't mind sharing that with us, Darren.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So depression and anxiety have been the two biggest ones that certainly that I've been treated for and I've recognized within myself. A lot of that comes from like childhood trauma. My parents split when I was were very young. I was 10 years old when my parents split up. And the kind of like the family dynamic was a bit unusual in the first instance. So my dad isn't actually named on my birth certificate. And I was always told like it's because that they weren't married at the time that I was born. So 1987, it was common practice that if the parents weren't married, like the father wouldn't be named on the birth certificate and the child would take the mother's name. And that kind of made sense to me. Like it didn't faze me. I've always taken my dad's name, you know, passport, national insurance, and all that is all got my dad's name on it. But when it came to the breakdown of the relationship and my mum became mentally unwell, slipped into a drug habit and alcoholism, and became clear that she wasn't in a good place to look after me and my brothers because my dad wasn't listed as being our legal guardian or our legal kind of biological father. We all ended up going into residential care and foster care, while my dad went through the family court system to try and prove that he was our biological father and was capable of looking after us.
And you were 10 at this point, weren't you, Darren? Is that right? When this was all happened, you got put into care, is that right?
That's right, yeah. So I spent a grand total of 3 years in residential and foster care, just simply because of the way the family court system works and how, you know, all the hoops that my dad had to jump through to actually win custody back of us from the state, essentially.
Yeah, it must have been really difficult. We really appreciate you sharing this with us, Darren. From my point of view, how would you describe the experience of care and foster care? How do you think it affected you at that point in your life, if you could reflect on it?
I mean, you hear horror stories all the time, and a lot of these kind of historical like sexual abuse cases and things like that have been floating around the news the last few years, 5 years, have all kind of come from care homes and stuff like that. I will have to say that wasn't my experience. I think in many ways, maybe like when you look back at how bad the system probably was at that time and has been for a long time, I was quite lucky. I do remember being kind of held up on a pedestal a little bit within the home as well, because I'd come from quite a stable family background in the initial sense, whereas a lot of the kids hadn't. So I was quite switched on. I was reasonably well educated to that point. I was doing very well in school, getting top grades and things like that. So I remember being kind of through those 3 years, I went to award ceremonies and things like that for social care and things like that. Like I was kind of really very well looked after and used as a kind of prime case of, you know, this is what kids in care look like. It's not what the media will tell you, even though largely that is what kids in care are. They are taken in at very young age. They don't have strong bonds with mum or dad, and as a result don't necessarily have the concentration levels to go through school and get a good education. So it was a weird time to really be kind of held in that regard. And that carried on throughout senior school, even then being back under the care of my dad. Like, I guess kind of because I was viewed so positively around my education, I then just organically started doing well at school anyway. And I was predicted great grades, like going into my GCSE year and everything else like that. But a lot of like external factors around my mum and really kind of like my mental health and my like first real bout of depression and anxiety really came through in that final year at school, possibly the worst possible time. And as a result, I just didn't receive anywhere near the grades that I was predicted.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. Just going back a little bit. So once you left care, so your dad got custody at that point. Is that what happened? Then you moved in, and was it just dad, or was there a stepmom involved as well?
Yeah, so my dad was in a relationship by this point, a new relationship. It was actually the woman that he left my mum for. He was in a relationship with this woman now. So they'd been together 2.5, 3 years by that point. I'd heard all these great stories, how she'd been so supportive and helped him through this process, and he couldn't have done it without her. And I was like, okay, amazing, can't wait to meet her. Like, she sounds, you know, like a great person to kind of be around and be involved with, etc. And then when we did finally meet her, and I moved in with my dad and everything else, it just kind of all unraveled a little bit. And whether that was kind of the pressure of her taking on, three, fairly grown boys at that point. So we were 13, 11, and my youngest brother would have been 6 or 7 at that time. So, we kind of been through quite a traumatic experience as well. It was behavior wise, maybe we weren't in a place where we would have been without that experience. But yeah, it was tough, and she didn't give us a fair shake, really, to be honest. And she made it very clear that that was the case.
Okay, so Darren, do you think that your stepmom just struggled really to deal with what you and your two brothers had been through, and maybe just your behaviour that you were presenting? Do you think it was more of just a retaliation to that? And how did she? What was it that she did that sort of wasn't the best way to go about things? How did she make things difficult for you? Would you say?
I understand now as an adult, and coming into a family that have kids already, like how difficult it can be. I think there was probably a little bit of resentment there, because for the first 3 years of her relationship with my dad, although my dad was, occupied with trying to win us back, largely she had him to herself. They had loads of quality time together in between everything. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you got 3 young boys come into the house and taking up that kind of that spare time. So I think there was definitely some resentment there in terms of kind of what we brought to that relationship. In terms of like what she did and how she behaved, just some examples would be, I'd get woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning for no good reason. It would be like something really petty, like, I don't know, there's a spider in the bathroom or something like that, and she couldn't wake my dad up because he had to get up for work. And it's like, okay, but it's completely okay to wake a 13-year-old boy up that's got to go to school in the morning. So just really petty, like minor issues that didn't need dealing with at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Just like an ongoing tension sort of thing going
Yeah,
on.
yeah. Just it would just constantly build. If I received a detention from school, the punishment was to stand in a corner of the room, and I wasn't allowed to move for sometimes up to an hour.
Wow, that's harsh.
Yeah, and I think these are punishments that she went through herself, because I know that she grew up with a stepdad herself. She never actually knew her biological father, and the stepdad was very strict. And so I get the feeling now, and looking back, that these were probably punishments that she went through herself. There would be times when she would make like food so like unedible, to a point where we would come across as being unappreciative. And it's not like being burnt or anything else like that, but it was just like flavor wise, and just, like ridiculous concoctions, like making burgers out of tuna meat and stuff like that. It was just like, and then frying it up and stuff like that. And in her head, it was like, oh, this is a really healthy alternative meal, etc., etc. And if we didn't eat it, it was like, oh, you don't appreciate it, except like, you don't understand like how much hard work I went through to make this for you. And we were almost then forced to eat it, because if we didn't eat it, then we weren't going to have a dinner. And it was like there was no alternative. It was like, eat that or nothing at all.
I can see. So there's almost like an episode of like, like a series of controlling behaviour, isn't it? Really, you can see
Yeah,
there.
definitely. Yeah. And there were times like where I, would just be kept off school, like randomly as well, like just random days out of school. She would make out like I was the one that was ill. Like she goes, "Oh, you don't look too good. Colour drained from your skin, and you're running a bit of temperature. Maybe you should stay off for a couple of days." I just went along with it, because, like, what 14-year-old boy is going to say, oh yeah, I'll stay at home. That's fine. Don't mind not going to school. Especially at the time I was being bullied at school anyway. So it was like a great excuse for me to just not go to school and deal with that. But yeah, just like looking back now, it's like, well, I wasn't ill. I was absolutely fine. Like, I don't understand why she would turn around and say that and keep me home. And again, it was for no good reason. We just ended up just like sitting indoors watching TV and just like not doing anything. Like there was no real reason for me to be there.
So you said that you were being bullied at school. What was going on there then, Darren? Well, and how do you think that was affecting you? Obviously not in a good way, but just give us an insight into what that was like for you, if you don't mind. I know it's quite a sensitive thing.
I think it was just a case of I just wasn't one of the popular kids. I wasn't that athletic. I wasn't in with the football team, or like PE would come around and it would be just kind of like, oh, it's just a lesson in a day, like do what you need to do and whatnot. But I wasn't competitive in any sense. And so the ones that like, I would get picked on the most by would be the athletes, like the football players, the tennis players and everything else like that. And when they were paired with me or I was on their team or whatever was going on, like it was just kind of that kind of, I was just made to feel like worthless, basically. Like it was, I was no good to them. So, and they made it very clear. And then away from like sports and stuff like that would kind of spill over into English and maths and science. It was just kind of like, this is someone that we can clearly pick on and take our frustrations out on, because when we're on the sports field, it's like he just takes it. So he's going to take it in English. He's going to take it in whatever.
So was it just verbal or was there physical bullying as well?
There was only a couple of instances of like physicality, but that was more just where I probably like got frustrated and squared up and stuff like that. And their first reaction was just to punch me in the mouth.
It's horrible, isn't it?
It is. And I think back now and I just think it was a really shit time. And it's amazing actually that I carried on and continued to get like the projection that I had going into my final year. But I like to look at the positives that come out of it. Like the friends that I did make at school are still my friends now. Like that group of guys that I hung around with and trusted and spent time with after school when I was allowed to, are still really, really close mates with now. Go on foreign holidays together. We run podcasts together. We do all sorts. So it's still very much like, I look at it as a positive time, because those bonds were formed and made stronger. And now 15, 20 years down the road, we're still very much in each other's lives as a result.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good friend unit that you've got. I always find it really interesting that out of a negative situation, there's always these big positives that come out of it, isn't there? And I think it's always a case of whether you like realize them or not, because you can literally just fall into victim mode when you've been through a crisis, or you can realize that these big changes or these big crises, they do actually have good things that come out of them, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one thing that I am thankful for. I think most of the time when I go through these situations, I do always try to take some good or some positive away from it. I have in other situations not dealt with things very well and have kind of fallen into victim mode on other occasions, but largely I do try to come out of it the other side, because if I let it affect me beyond that one moment, then that one moment starts to become more than a moment. It becomes kind of life defining in a sense.
I completely understand and relate to that, Darren. So going back to your story then, so I believe it was you were 15 when you went back to live with your mum, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So this was GCSE year. I'd lived with my stepmom and my dad at that time for 2 years. And just the pattern of behavior was just relentless. And it wasn't just me, it was my brothers as well. So I left home when I was 15, went to go live with my mum. My brother, that's 2 years younger than me, he left around about the same age, 15, 16, so another couple of years later. And then my youngest brother actually left home when he was 12. and went to go live with his now wife, which is pretty mad to say that. So, and he got really lucky actually in that sense. Like he had a girlfriend through school. He had like the strength and the maturity at 12 years old to open up to his girlfriend's mum and say, like, this is what's happening. It's been happening for a long time. I don't like it. It's affecting me really badly. And she took him in. She had a conversation with my dad. My dad kind of just brushed it off and didn't believe her, didn't believe any of us that any of this was happening, because, you know, he loved her. Like it was the relationship that supported him through probably one of the more difficult times in his life. And so he went to go live with her, his girlfriend's mum, and they're still together now. They've been a couple now for 14 years, and they've been married for 5 of them.
Wow, they sound like a super strong couple.
Yeah.
So I know your mum had some issues with addiction, Darren. So when you were living with her, how did that affect you in terms of your mental health that was becoming apparent, like your depression and anxiety while you were still at school?
My mum's drug addiction started very soon after the relationship between her and my dad broke down. So it was from what I remember, or from what I know, it was heroin addiction mixed with loads of other things. So it was like alcohol was quite prevalent as well, and it just completely like messed with her mental state and mental health throughout the period of myself being in care and living with my dad. She was in and out of mental institutions to kind of set her straight, I guess, if that's a way of thinking about it. But it was just really, it was putting a plaster on a gaping wound. Like she would go into these institutions for maybe weeks at a time and then come out, and then the pattern of behavior would just resurface. So from what I know, the drug addiction ceased when I was 13, 14. So she'd been addicted or been in that cycle of behavior for 2 or 3 years. And she went like the like methadone and substitute and replacement like therapy to get her off of it. And as far as I'm aware, and certainly it reflected in her behavior as well, she was clean for a very, very long time after that. It was just that the alcohol was still played a massive part. She didn't really ever recover mentally from that kind of cycle of behavior. Those like 2 or 3 years have gone on to define the next 20. She still struggles now with alcohol addiction. She's self-harmed and tried to commit suicide several times. One particular occasion, whilst I was actually in the house, she cut her wrists.
And that was really difficult. That must have been really difficult for you.
That was probably the most traumatic experience that I've had with my mum. So I was 16 at the time. And yeah, dealing with the fallout and the aftermath of that, I didn't actually speak to my mum for nearly 2 years after that. So that was probably, yeah, that was really, really tough. And I couldn't go back to my dad's because obviously I knew what the implications of that were going to be. It was just going to be another cycle of kind of mental abuse. So I just ended up like sofa surfing, sleeping at mates' houses, and it just kind of, yeah, like it then kind of controlled the way I behaved for the next 4 or 5 years. Like jobs were hard to keep hold of because I didn't have a stable address. Going out partying every weekend because I was staying at these people's houses, and obviously they had like particular lifestyles and stuff. So
what was happening in your mind and your mental health at this point then? So how were you dealing or not dealing with things so well, and how was it affecting your life?
When I was not dealing with it, that was probably that's the biggest thing that's come out of it. Now as a, you know, I say a recovered man, like I'm still recovering, I think, still working on myself to try and get over those traumas. But looking back now, I didn't deal with it. I just threw myself into any job that I could get. I would try and earn anywhere between 150, 200 pound a week, just so I could then go and blow 100, 150 quid of it on a Saturday, Sunday night, and then just repeat the cycle, sleep on someone's sofa, work for the week, earn the money, go to a party. And I did that for about 5 years.
That's something I can totally relate to. Not dealing with the issue, and behind the scenes, it's building and building, isn't it? And then you bring those issues into when you meet someone you want to seriously settle down with. You bring those issues in there that you've not resolved, don't you? What's your thoughts on that?
No, 100%. I actually did have relationships throughout that period. Incredibly, I honestly wouldn't know. I couldn't tell you today how they put up with me. To put it nicely, it was a very interesting period of my life. I wasn't really a nice person either about it. I didn't deal with anything that caused me to be emotional. It was just anger. That was the first thing I would go to every time. Like if I was stressed or I couldn't do a job, or even lifting a heavy weight. Like if the job required me to lift something heavy and I couldn't do it, I wouldn't ask for anyone's help. I would struggle to the point where I would, in some cases, injure myself, and then I would beat myself up because I was hopeless, I was useless, and all those thoughts and feelings about not being this athletic kind of strong person were come back from my school days, being on the sports field. And it was just kind of a really weird, interesting time of my life. And if I could go back, I would absolutely change more or less all of it. But at the same time, I don't think I would be the person that I am today without it, if that makes sense.
Now, that's a really good point, and it would be great to have a time machine to go back and remedy the things that we've all done wrong, etc. But like you say, often the things that have happened to us has actually shaped us and give us a point to actually make a comparison from, so we can become a better person. Whereas, say, if everything's amazing in your life and you'd never have a crisis, what sort of learning do you get from that, and how can you possibly develop? That's what I always think.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. So, Darren, why do you think that men find it so hard to speak about their mental health problems?
It's an interesting question. I think the age-old answer is that men don't feel like they should ask for help. They feel like they should always have the answers to help themselves, which in reality is quite ridiculous, because nobody teaches you how to deal with it necessarily, unless you're fortunate enough to have a stable family home, good parents that teach you about emotional intelligence and how to handle certain situations, and develop tools within you that give you self-confidence and self-belief, which is very rare. I don't see many examples of kids being raised in that manner. It either kind of seems like one end of the scale or the other. Like you either grow up with really strict parents, or you grow up with the hippie kind of style parents that just let you get away with everything. But eventually they all end up on the shrink's couch at bemoaning various issues at either end of the spectrum. So I don't think, unless you are raised and given those tools from a very young age, we don't know how to deal with these situations. We don't have the answers, and we do need to ask for help, because we're just not educated in that manner. The idea that men grow up with this fallacy that we have all the answers and we shouldn't need to ask for help is, in my mind, is quite ridiculous, because we're never given the tools young enough to deal with the pressures of adult life, really, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's always that stiff upper lip thing, isn't it? So in my family anyway, and I come from a lovely family, but you always saw the men, my uncles and my dad, as strong men who lead the way and they're confident. You feel that pressure to become the leader and not to show any weakness, don't you? I suppose.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the examples that I had growing up as well have a lot to do with that. Very similar veins. So my granddad had a stroke when he was 40 years of age. He was paralyzed down the left side of his body, but he showed incredible like courage and strength and just mentally it didn't seem to phase him. Or certainly as grandson, like growing up, I never saw it as his disability. Like he would still get up, grab a walking stick and come and play football with me. He still had a job, like went to work every day. And that like came across in my dad as well. So some people might be wondering why my stepmom was able to get away with the kind of behavior that she did, and why my dad didn't believe it. Well, it's largely because my dad wasn't in the house. Like he would work 14, 15-hour days to make sure that we all always had everything that we always needed. Like there was food in the cupboards, lights were always on, we had clothes on our back, we were able to go out and do stuff at the weekends when he had the spare time to do so. And so that kind of work ethic and courage and kind of mental fortitude, it was always instilled in me as a young boy. But that's the way that men should be. And so when I had my own mental struggles, my own issues that I didn't deal with, it kind of put me in a negative tailspin that, well, why am I not like them? Why can I not deal with this in the same way that they dealt with it? And knowing now, like the answer to that is they probably didn't deal with it very well. They just hid it very well.
Yeah, I think that sums it up well. That behind the scenes, there's still the same emotions going on that women have, isn't there? Really, well, in a different way, but you know what I mean, in terms of turmoil about crisis and self-image and all the normal things that happen in the brain. But like you say, the man often struggles to deal with that, and I suppose that's why I can remember the picture of the stories you hear about the man drinking in the pub all evening and coming home drunk to the woman and stuff like that. I suppose it's because really, instead of dealing with their feelings, they're just going and drinking it away. And you can see how a lot of people fell into that situation. But secondly to that, I would say that things are taking a positive step in the right direction, and men are starting to talk about their problems more. And there is a lot more media attention about male mental health. So that's a really good step in the right direction. So I think that's really good. But the fact still remains that so many men are taking their lives each week, and hopefully we can start to change that with all of this media attention and as many movements or publicity as we can get, for sure. So Darren, I just wanted to delve a bit further into your depression and anxiety. Is it still something that you struggle with now, and if so, what's your go-to methods for dealing with it?
So I have my good days and my bad days, like everyone. I've not needed any medication for depression or anxiety for 3 years now. I was on, I forget the name of it, citalopram. So I was taking 30 milligrams of citalopram once a day, and I did that for about 18 months, I think, something like that, 18 months, nearly 2 years. And then I just kind of had this thought and feeling that didn't want to always be taking tablets like every day for the rest of my life just to feel okay. And that really kind of was like the mark of my mental recovery and me working on myself and working with guys like Fidel Bohill, the modern man coach, guys like speaking and being introduced to guys like yourself that are very open and honest with their mental health and how they deal with it, and giving myself the tools to deal with those bad days a lot better. And do you know what? It's really, really helped that my fiance has had similar battles with mental health and still does. Like she still suffers massively with anxiety. There's loads of things that she wishes that she could do, but she can't, or feels like she can't. And she's kind of really helped me build myself up and give me that self-confidence, but also the self-awareness to like catch those bad days and make it sure that it's only just one day out of a whole week, rather than that one day becoming 2, 3, and then it becomes a month, then it becomes 6 months. And before you know it, you find yourself in a bit of a hole that you can't really dig yourself out of.
For sure, a problem shared is a problem half, definitely. And I think it's great that you and your partner can speak about your issues openly between yourselves. And also, I just wanted to point out, and anyone that's listening, by no means am I saying that women deal with all of their mental health problems fine by talking about it. Obviously, mental health is a problem that affects anyone from any walk of life. But the main concern with men is just often we withhold those feelings too much, don't we? So, yeah.
Well, I think the stereotype is true to a certain degree, that women are quite easily jump on the phone, or these days it's like Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever, and they've got a really strong group of 3 or 4 women that they can just talk to about absolutely anything. And I think for us guys, we don't necessarily have that. We have like strong relationships with our male friends, but it's mostly bonded over things like work and football and going for beers and stuff like that. Like there's very rarely do you find a group of male friends that will sit down at a table at a pub and go, "How you doing, mate? You feeling all right?" And it just doesn't happen. And when we get those pressures and those mental kind of breakdowns and those bouts of depression and anxiety, the last thing that we do is go onto Messenger or go onto WhatsApp or pick up the phone to your best mate and go, "Yeah, I'm really struggling at the moment," when we should.
And I think that failure to talk about issues unfortunately leads to these horror stories which we hear about men who are supposedly fine, and the next thing they're unfortunately they've taken their own life. And it's a real shame to hear that, a real shock as well. Every time you hear a story like that of someone who knows someone, or whether it's someone you knew even, it's real tragedy to hear that, because you just think, and you know in the back of your mind, that if they just spoke about it, then most likely that could have prevented the suicide. So it's really, really important to speak about any crisis that's going on in your head, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you look at certainly more famous examples, the Robin Williams, the Gary Speeds, that out of absolutely nowhere, or seemingly out of absolutely nowhere, you wake up one morning and it's a breaking news. And you just think, how has that happened? Like, because I still vividly remember waking up on Sunday morning and hearing about Gary Speed taking his own life. And I thought, like, that would, like, out of everything, out of all of the things that could have happened to him, that was absolutely bottom of the pile. Yeah, manager for his country, successful, well off financially, had a great playing career. But the thing that struck me the most was that he was actually on a football TV show live as well. That on the very day before, he was on a BBC program talking about the final scores and stuff like that. You just would never have known. You would just never have known that 6-7 hours later, he was going to go home and take his own life.
Yeah, it's just so tragic. I can remember it myself. It was a real shock, wasn't it? But there's often many of those stories, and it just shows the power of what's going on in the mind and how much people can withhold it, isn't it? So it's just real shocking. But yeah, hopefully we can keep bringing that down, because I know the suicide rate is at the worst it's been, I think, since 2003. So hopefully we can all keep doing what we can to try and bring that down. Like I say, just to share problems is the best thing that people can do.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like, obviously this year will be an exceptional year for obvious reasons, but I do hope that we do see a downward trend going forward. So I read somewhere that suicide is the biggest killer in men under the age of 40.
That's
And
right,
then
yeah.
when it's over the age of 40, it's still the second biggest killer behind things like heart disease and cancer and stuff like that.
It's all very tragic indeed. So, Darren, I just want to say a massive thank you for joining me on the show today. Just before we do finish, I always like to ask guests, if there's somebody listening now and they're going through a real crisis where they're either really depressed or anxious, or they are considering taking their own life, what is your advice to them?
My advice would be to pick up the phone, get on Messenger, get on WhatsApp, whatever way you communicate with your friends. And I wouldn't say that it's exclusive to just your male friends, female friends, family, mum, dad, aunts, uncles, whoever you confide in, trust the most. just speak to them. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be afraid to do so, because I think you'll be very surprised at the overwhelming amount of support, whether it's work troubles, financial troubles, relationship, marriage problems, whatever it is. It's solvable, and it's solvable just by talking about it and getting it out into the open. And you'll be incredibly surprised at just how much support there will be for you if you just take that first step and bring other people into your problems.
That's great advice, Darren. Thank you. So we'll wrap up there then, Darren. But just before we do, are you looking forward to Christmas? Got any plans for Christmas in this what's going to be a peculiar Christmas?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a quiet one this year. Obviously, not being able to have masses of friends around at the house and stuff like that. It's where we are. We're tier 2, so we can't associate outside of our household indoors. And who wants to celebrate anything outdoors on December 25th, right?
Yeah. Okay, so thanks again, Darren, so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show and sharing all that you did. You really help people doing that, so thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And just remember, it's okay not to be okay.